Happy autumn, everybody. It's nice to see you all here, and some of you I don't see, sorry. It's my pleasure to introduce Liz Hobson to our first in-person seminar in too many years. Liz grew up in upstate New York. Then she showed brevity by leaving the U.S. to a foreign exotic country where she did an undergrad degree at McGill University. Afterwards, Liz really wanted to study chaos. And for this she went to another foreign country, New Mexico. And there she started to develop original computational techniques for studying social behavior. It had several more years as a postdoc in two of the leading computational biology institutes in North America, first in Tennessee, then at the Santa Fe Institute, where she honed her impressive computational techniques and produced some beautiful publications, and we're going to hear about those and more recent stuff that I don't know about in a second. Thank you, Liz, and
yeah, thank you, Ruben. Well, thanks everybody for the invitation and for having me here. I'm really excited. This is my first in-person seminar talk since all this happened. So I'm really excited to be back in person and talking with you today. So today what I want to do in the talk is show you how in my work and the work of my group, what we're doing is blending observational and experimental data collection on social behavior with these computational methods that Ruben referenced. And we're doing that to give us this combined insight into animal decision making and look at how we can learn about animal cognition from watching what they do on the social side. So basically, whoop. Good? Oh, thanks. So one of the things that I find really fascinating about this combination of sociality and cognition is that sociality for animals and for humans too provides a lot of benefits, but it also involves a lot of intra-group competition. So for example, if you have a group of, here in this case, lions, you have individuals forming affiliative bonds with each other, cooperating with those same individuals to repel an external threat, for example, but then potentially turning around and competing with those very same individuals for access to resources and other things. So there's this balancing act that animals have to do between the costs and the benefits of being in a social group. And in a lot of cases, animals must constantly decide who to interact with and how to interact with those animals. To complicate things even further, social worlds, we know, change over time. That's a fundamental property of social systems. So you can see change due to group membership via demographic processes. You can also see change due to relationships strengthening or weakening over time. And so this social information that individuals may have to be gathering about each other, that may be an open-ended process requiring sustained attention, memory, and updating. And so the cognitive side is really important to think about when you're thinking about animal sociality. And that combination of the social side and the cognitive side have led to a lot of hypotheses about potential connections between the two. So for example, you can see a lot of these hypotheses falling under something that we think of now as the social brain hypothesis, where essentially the computational demands of sociality are hypothesized to require greater cognitive capacity. But there's a major assumption that underlies a lot of these hypotheses, right? And that's this assumption that sociality is hard, right? And that it's harder than other things like foraging and other kinds of behaviors. So we have this major assumption, but the other thing that is really difficult about testing these hypotheses is that we don't know the cognitive load of sociality in a lot of these species. And for most species, we don't even know what the animals actually know about their social systems. So it's been really hard to make direct connections between the social side and the cognitive side in many, many species. So what I'm doing in my work and with my group is that we're using an integrative approach to really carefully parse the potential connections between sociality and cognition. So we're trying to identify areas where potentially there's interesting cognition going on that we're inferring from the social side, and then we can go in the future do more targeted cognitive experiments on those particular groups or individuals. So to do this kind of integration, what we use is a lot of behavioral observations, experimental manipulations, and computational modeling. And we look across those different methods to integrate across what can we learn about the observations with the computational methods, for example. We look at this within single species, like these parakeets that you can see cropping up here quite a bit. We'll talk a lot more about them today. But we also look comparing across different species, too, to see how cognition, the potential for cognition, and how realized sociality differs across lots of different species. All right, so one caveat here, right, is that connecting the social processes to underlying cognition has to be done very carefully, right? We cannot assume that anything that we see has a cognitive basis, but we also can't assume that everything that we see is by default a simple rule. So we really have to go in and say, how much of what the complexity of what we're seeing on the social side has a cognitive basis. And I really love this quote that I saw in a recent preprint. Correlation does not imply cognition. So that just really highlights we have to be really careful when we're approaching these kinds of systems. So just because a model in the paper, or in our case, observational data, correlates with brain or behavioral data, that's not sufficient to say that it actually is a cognitive process. So keep that in mind for the duration of the talk. All right, so I mentioned we're going to talk mostly about parakeets today, but in the lab we work on a ton of different species. And you can see here, this is my current lab structure with the postdocs, the grad students, the undergrads, the techs, and the postdocs. And you can see, I love networks, so this is a network diagram here. We've got connections between everybody studying what study species they're working on. So we've got a lot of connections across different projects and a lot of people working on a range of different study systems in the lab, which, as you'll see at the end, is giving us some really exciting kind of comparative possibilities. All right, what I'm going to focus on today is, as I said, mostly the parakeets, a little bit of our Bob White system here, and mostly focusing on aggression, fighting, and dominance hierarchies. So I've been studying dominance hierarchies for a while now. Dominance has a long history of being studied. So it was originally published as Peck order in the 1920s. And this original paper here is absolutely fascinating to go back and read. It's been translated. It's got some great quotes in there, right? So this original researcher was very poetical and said things like, "Anyone who thinks the inhabitants of a chicken yard are thoughtless, happy creatures with a daily life of undisturbed pleasure is thoroughly mistaken. A grave seriousness lies over the chicken yard." We just don't write like that anymore. So this is a great paper to go back in and get the insights about sociality, about dominance hierarchies, and get a good window into how people used to describe these things. But what I want to pitch today is that aggression, conflict, and these social dominance patterns can really be used as a model system to study the feedbacks between the social side, what's going on with how they're choosing their fights, and the cognitive side. How are they processing that information? What do they remember? What are they paying attention to? We see this even with a phrase that we have in English, right? Choose your battles wisely. I love this phrase, right? Because it highlights all three of these components that I'm thinking about here. So choose, right? There's a decision between several choices. Your battles, right? Conflict is present and expected at a certain level. And the wisely part highlights this cognitive component where some choices have better outcomes than others. So a lot of the work that we do on dominance hierarchies focuses on trying to figure out how much the individuals within those hierarchies actually know about their own rank and the rank of others in their groups. So today for the talk, what I'm going to focus on are these three sections here, these three kind of major questions So first, we're going to look at what fight-by-fight decisions can potentially tell us about the information individuals are paying attention to in real time. Here, we're going to look at very, very new results in the parakeet system. Then I'm going to ask what kinds of hidden patterns might structure aggression within the confines of a hierarchy. So here, this is more settled published data, and we're going to look across a lot of different species. Then, at the end, we're going to dig into how flexible these social systems are and whether they can shift to different dominance patterns across over time. So how flexible are they? And we're going to look at, again, new results from the parakeets and a little bit of brand new results in the bobwhite quail. Actually, just got these results from my graduate student as I was boarding the plane to come here for the talk. So these are super fresh, which is always exciting. All right, so we're going to start with the monk parakeet system. So I'll run you through just kind of an introduction to the study species as a whole. So the monk parakeets are highly social. They nest colonially in these big aggregations here that can have shared nest structures. They're native to temperate South America, but they've established populations worldwide through being escaping from or being intentionally released from the pet trade. And so you can see them in a range of habitats. So I heard a rumor that they actually successfully nested outside of Montreal for several years. And as somebody who went to McGill and lived through those winters, that's very impressive for a parrot. So most of the data that I'll be showing you today is not from wild or feral populations, it's from captives. But I have done work in their native range in Argentina. That's me way back in grad school doing some observations. And most of the data that we work with for the social structure research is coming from captive experiments. Okay, so basically to run you through how we do these captive experiments, we first need to be able to identify all the birds. So we mark them all so they're individually identifiable and recognizable. So here you can see we have our super technical method of drawing all over their faces with Sharpie markers. This works really well, and doesn't, so far we haven't found any indication that it changes their behavior, but they're extremely destructive, and they've been able to remove all the other marks and tags that we've tried to put on them. So this is a good way to individually recognize them. Then what we do is we take the whole group and we put it in a flight pen. So these are large, semi-natural flight pens that are outdoors. They're exposed to the weather, natural predation pressure, hawks fly by all the time. And so it's a relatively good compromise between having control over the system and having a relatively natural environment for them. So we collect a lot of data on these groups. So we collect information on nearest neighbors. So you can see here, these guys are sitting next to each other. We collect data on affiliation. These two are, this one's alloprene, the other one. And we collect information on aggression. So for the directed behaviors, we would say who is the actor and who is the target of the behavior. And we collect those data in real time directly into an iPad. So we can analyze the data in real time during the field season, which is really critical for something you'll see in just a second. Okay, so all the aggression stuff. We take the aggression and we use it to rank all the individuals based on their fight outcomes. The parakeets, as you'll see, fight all the time. So we have a ton of fight data on them. Basically, what you do to find the rank is you aggregate all of the fight outcomes in a matrix. So here you have the number of times that individual A won 12 times against individual B. And then you can do various different kinds of rank embedding methods to find the continuous power scores of the individuals and their ordinal ranks. So for example, we use a modified version of PageRank, which is a network eigenvector centrality measure. All right, so in the end then, we get the ranks of all the individuals from, this is one group from the high-ranked individuals down to the low-ranked individuals. And here you can see all their headshots. They're always cute. Okay, so to start out with, what I want to highlight first in this system is this idea about dynamic rule following, right? What can the fight-by-fight decisions tell us about what information these parakeets are paying attention to in real time? So this is a project led by my PhD student, Xavier Francis, and these are pretty new results, but they look really exciting so far. So these fight-by-fight decisions, we can think of these as rules, right? Something happens, right? There's a fight that takes place between two individuals. What do those two individuals do next? And what does the audience who watched that fight, what do they do? So I'll highlight two different rules that Xavier is working on. So we have in both cases an initiating event and then kind of the aggressive response afterwards. And if the aggressive response follows the patterns that we set forth in the rules, that's counted as rule following. All right, so our first rule then is called pile on. So this is a case where we've got a recent loser here that loses the fight, and that individual then is also aggressed against by one of the audience members to the fight, right? An uninvolved individual comes in and also wins against that individual. The other rule that I want to highlight is pass along. So here, an individual will target a lower ranked bird after it loses. So if this is a high ranked bird who wins against a slightly lower ranked bird, that individual should then target an individual that's lower ranked than itself and pass that aggression down the hierarchy, essentially. So keep in mind, too, these are based on different kinds of information, right? This is an observation-based rule where the individual that comes in and is the actor in the second part of the event was not involved in the first part, in the initiating event. This one, one of the individuals that were involved then acts in a different way in the second event. And there's some information about rank in this second rule here. Okay, so in order to see if they're following rules at a level that it wouldn't be expected given random ordering of all of these events, we use an approach called reference models. So this detects this time-dependent targeting choice. So we ask things like, how often are the rules followed in the observed data compared to data where the event ordering is broken, is randomized. So for example, we take the observed aggression order here, and from that we can get the number of times the observed rule is followed, and then we randomize the order of these events. So we keep the target, the actor and the target, that dyad stays together, but is randomly reordered. So you can see here, we've got A fights with C, and then C fights with A, right? Like a classic retaliation event. Over here, once we've randomized, then we have A targeting C, but then the next randomly ordered event is C targets D. So what we do is do that over and over again, and each time we see how many times are the rules followed in that randomized ordering of the data set, and then we do it again, see again how many times is the rule followed. And then we can get a distribution of what we'd expect the parakeets to be doing if the event ordering doesn't matter to them, right, if it's random. All right, so let's look at pile-on first. So again, that's targeting the most recent loser, right? You can see here we've got our distribution of how many times we expect them to be following the rule if the event ordering doesn't matter, if randomly we can reproduce the amount of time that or the number of times they're following the events. And you can see we expect them to be following this rule about 350 times. In contrast, you might notice this red line over here. This is how much they're actually following the rule. So we see this incredible difference between what we'd expect them to be doing if there's no effect of time on the ordering of events versus what they're actually doing. So this is really good evidence for us that individuals are observing the fights between other group members, and they're using that social information to start their next fights, right? These are observers to that fight that aren't involved, that are swooping in and getting that recent loser. We've also done these analyses, these preliminary analyses are the most conservative way that we can set up this rule. So they have to react within 60 seconds to the initiating event. And it has to be the very next thing that happens. So we've done it very conservatively so far. That's one of the things that we're going to loosen up in the next results. But it's really striking to see such a strong result, even with the really conservative approach. So if we look at pass along, what we see is the opposite pattern. We expect them, if the event orders are randomized, we expect them to be doing this pass-along behavior quite a bit more than they actually are in real life. So here, this is evidence that the group members are avoiding using that pass-along rule. And potentially this is due to something like a real-time loser effect, where a recent loser then is not going out and becoming aggressive against another individual immediately following a loss. So what I showed you in this little section with these preliminary results is whether individuals are paying attention to these fight-by-fight decisions. And the answer is yeah, they do seem to be reacting in ways that are either following the rule or avoiding using specific rules. And individuals are also using their own experiences and observations of others' fights to make rapid decisions about how to act. Remember, this all has to happen within a 60-second window to be counted in the current analyses. So these kinds of approaches are telling us kind of in real time, something happens, how do the parakeets react? And if they do react in a consistent way, that allows us to go back on the cognitive side and say, well, they were paying attention, right, because they reacted in a certain way. And for rank-based rules, they're paying attention, but they're also in real time integrating some information about their own rank and the rank of others in order to make those decisions that they're making. All right, so the next question we're going to get at is looking at the hidden kinds of patterns that might structure aggression within the confines of a dominance hierarchy. So here we're going to look across a lot of different species. And when I say a lot of different species, I mean 85 different species. This is a phenomenal historical data set on dominance studies that was compiled by Dai Shizuka and Dave McDonald in their 2015 paper here, and is a phenomenal resource for doing comparative work on social behavior. Dominance hierarchies and aggression are one of our best chances for doing this kind of cognitive or kind of comparative work because it's a more apples to apples comparison than something like, you know, a network of preening and a network of food sharing or something. We don't know if those two networks functionally are similar in any way. So with aggression, at least, they're all fighting and they're all achieving rank in their groups. So we've got a much better chance of doing comparative work with this kind of social behavior. All right, so in this project, this was a collaboration with Dan Munster and Simon Dedeo. And what we did was look at whether animals are just following a hierarchy at the most basic level, or if there's more structure in there. And so we identified 3 potential social dominance patterns. The first one we call a downward heuristic, which is just at the most basic level, follow the rules of the hierarchy, right? Attack anybody ranked lower than yourself. But we can also think of more complex strategies here, such as close competitors, where you attack anybody ranked slightly below yourself, and bullying, where you attack anybody ranked at the far end of the hierarchy, ranked far below yourself. So if you think about aggression as a network here, you can see this is one of our parakeet networks of aggression. All of the edges here, these curves, are aggressive events. The line thickness tells you how many times a particular individual was aggressive towards another individual. Each of the individuals is the circles, the nodes in the network. And the color and the side of the edges tell you if that aggression was directed down the hierarchy, which is in blue, or up the hierarchy, kind of a rule-breaking instance in the red here. And so if we map these patterns onto the hierarchy, each individual has a different set of potential opponents or targets according to the different rules. So let's take a look at decisions for this guy here, highlighted with yellow arrow. So if it's following a downward heuristic, it can attack this entire set of individuals. And it should spread its aggression randomly across all of those individuals. If it's following a close competitor strategy, it might direct its aggression across just these 3 or just a couple of individuals in the smaller set of targets. If it's using a bullying strategy, it's going to direct its aggression just at these individuals at the very bottom of the hierarchy. So you can see how those 2 strategies here are nested within the more basic the more general strategy. So what we're looking at is how many times are groups following the general, just they have a hierarchy, versus they have more structure in the hierarchy. They have a more complex social dominance pattern. So what we see if we look across all of our different species, this is with all the groups by order here. All of these are color-coded based on what kind of social dominance pattern each groups in those orders was using. And what we see in general is that 77%, the majority of groups across all of these species, are using they have a hierarchy, right? There's nothing more interesting going on other than they have a hierarchy. But we see 22% of these groups that show evidence of more complex strategies. So we see 13% of the groups are using close competitors patterns, and 9% are using a bullying pattern. If we dig in even more, we have some species where we had multiple social groups that were sampled. And if we look across those 37 species where we did have multiple social groups, what you can see is 17 of them, so 46%, were using multiple social dominance patterns. And 3 of the species here, highlighted in orange, had groups that were using each of the 3 social dominance patterns. So there's a lot of variability in which patterns are used across the taxa that we looked at, and also which pattern is used for a particular species across different groups. So basically from this paper we concluded you got to be really careful. Don't think of social dominance patterns necessarily as a characteristic of your species. It's more likely a characteristic of that particular group that would be safer. But we also started thinking, how flexible are these groups? Can we actually cause a group to shift to a different social dominance pattern? So that's going to be the question that I get into here. We're going to use 2 different perturbation experiments to experimentally get at this. So the first experiment is we're going to ask, is the removal of a single individual from a group sufficient to trigger a shift in the group's social dominance pattern? So in order for this to happen, the majority of the individuals in the group, have to change who they're targeting, which set of individuals they're targeting with their aggression. It can't just be one individual that changes. So this is a group level shift. The second perturbation experiment asks whether the separation of an entire group is sufficient to trigger, and the reestablishment of that group is sufficient to trigger a shift in the social dominance patterns. So for the first one, we're going to look at parakeets again, and the second one, we're going to look at very incredibly new data from our bobwhite quail. So we're going to start again with the parakeets. And this is work led by my postdoc, Annemarie van der Marel, and with a great crew of several more of my PhD students working on various aspects of this project. So we're going to look at this exact thing, right? If we have a group of parakeets, we take one out, what happens to the rest of the group? So we're not just going to take one out, we're also going to put it back in too. So we have targeted removal and replacement of the birds, and we did this by rank. So here you can see an example of our experimental timeline. So we've got the first perturbation here. This is the first bird was removed at this point. It's removed for 8 days, then it's reintroduced into the group, and we follow the group for another 8 days. Then we do another perturbation cycle after that. So we can see, what does the group do when that bird is gone? And what does the group and that bird, how do they cope with the reintroduction of that individual? So we're going to start with data that we have on a larger social group and data from our 2021 field season. And this data set involves about 20,000 fights between the parakeets. I told you, they fight a lot. All right, so just to give you kind of a little bit of a feel for what's going on in response to these perturbations, we do see big changes in terms of rank when we do these perturbations. So we've got trials 1, 2, 3 up here. We've got our rank assessment points down here where we do a 3-day three-day window to snapshot what the rank is. And then we've got the power scores. So the higher they are up here, the higher they are in power and rank in that group, the more dominant they are. And you can see highlighted our 3 birds that we perturbed. So for this one, you can see we removed it and it plummeted in rank. It rejoined the group at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. Similar thing happened with the second one. It dropped really significantly, not quite to the bottom of the hierarchy, but pretty close. And the third trial also, just rank fell off a cliff, and that bird rejoined the hierarchy at the very, very bottom. So these rank changes and the power score changes are much more extreme than we see any of the fluctuations in the actual group members that are remaining. And what we think is that what these results are showing is that the loss of rank spots and power scores were much more extreme for these removed birds than for others in the group. So let's look at the group responses too, though. So what we can see here is, again, these dominance pattern assessment points going across the x-axis, and then what dominance pattern we categorize the group as using on the y-axis. This is highlighting the removal stage up here, and this is just broken out. We're going to highlight the replacement stage down here. So first, with the removals, what you can see is we did have one shift here, but these two are staying the same. The removals, or the replacements, all three of those replacements, the group is shifting from a downward heuristic, just follow the hierarchy, into a bullying pattern. And what we see is extreme levels of aggression directed towards those replaced individuals that are reintroduced into the group. So you may be thinking now, well, is this a function of rank, right? These are all top-ranked birds that we perturbed. Does this happen when you take out other ranked birds, or is this particular to the top ranks? So this spring, what we did is test exactly that. So with a new field season of data, we have two smaller groups, so we have some replication now, and we did 6 perturbations for each of those two groups, 3 where we took out and replaced the top-ranked bird, and 3 where we took out and replaced a middle or a low-ranked bird. And then what we're asking here is, how does the group respond to the removal of these middle or low-ranked birds? How consistent are these group-level responses? Do we really see a difference between how the group reacts to the removal and replacement of a top-ranked bird versus a middle or a low-ranked bird? Okay, so these are our controls, which we're using as the middle or the low-ranked birds, and comparing them to our top-ranked bird perturbations. So we can see is we've got the social dominance assessment points, again, across the x-axis here. And for the first replicate group and the second replicate group, you got an indication of what kind of social dominance pattern they were following. So if we look at this, this is, again, just the middle and the low-ranked birds. What we see is that when we remove the birds, 17%, so just one of the trials, we saw a shift in the social dominance pattern. On the reintroductions, we saw half the groups had a shift in the social dominance pattern. Now, when we looked at how those compared to perturbing the top-ranked birds, we see a really striking difference. So the removals caused shifts in 83% of our trials, and the reintroductions, again, caused shifts in 50% of the trials. So we're seeing many more shifts in the social dominance pattern when the top-ranked bird is perturbed compared to the lower-ranked birds. So again, when we looked at the question of, is the removal of a single individual sufficient to trigger a shift in the group's social dominance pattern, what we're finding in the parakeets so far is indications of, yes, it is possible, but not in every single case. And it does also appear, based on these new trials, that the rank of the removed bird is affecting the propensity of the group to shift. And we're seeing those stronger responses to perturbations of the top-ranked bird. Now, interestingly, it's not just aggression that happens in these groups. There's a lot of partner formation, there's a lot of friendship alliances that form. And so another one of my students, Claire O'Connell, is currently looking at all of the stuff that we've been doing on the aggressive and the hierarchy side, but through the lens of affiliation and partner formation. So Claire's been looking at how heterogeneity in social support might be critical in explaining rank changes and group dynamics. So we're finding some interesting things on that side. So new relationships can form really quickly in these parakeets. And if we remove birds from the group, and that breaks a partnership, those abandoned partners can reform a new partnership, sometimes on the scale of hours. So it happens really frequently. And sometimes those poor guys that we remove, we put them back in, and their previous partner does not return to being affiliative with them. So they get abandoned. And this happens on a pretty quick time scale. So we've got just a ton of social drama still to dig into on the parakeet side. Okay, but let's leave the parakeets then. Let's go over to the bobwhite quail system. So here, we're going to do another perturbation. This is a different species and a slightly different setup to the group. But we're going to say, okay, let's take the group. Then let's let them establish a dominance hierarchy. Let's separate them for a while, have a cooling down period, reform the group, and see if that's sufficient to shift the social dominance pattern to something different. So what we did in the bobs, we call them the bobs. They're fun. So this is work led by my PhD student, Sanjay Prasher. And this is also pretty new. As I said, I just saw these results very, very recently, so this will be exciting. But some background on the northern bobwhite quail. They have a large traditional range, so they range from Mexico and Cuba all the way up to southern Ontario, but they're threatened or near threatened in most of their range. So they've had real problems with habitat destruction, habitat loss. That's really knocked down their populations. So in the wild, they form, they're regarded as social, and they form these mixed sex groups called coveys. And they can be usually on the scale of 3 to 20 individuals. And they're especially social in the non-breeding season. So especially in the winter here, they tend to forage together and move together in these cohesive coveys. They may stay in the coveys for quite some time, but we don't have really good data from them in the wild because it's hard to track them because they get eaten by everything. They're like popcorn out there. Everybody likes to predate them. So it's really hard to put an expensive GPS tracker on the back of snack food, essentially. And they just get eaten all the time. So one thing we're doing in the lab now is we don't have predators, so we can get really good social data on what's going on. And the goal is to eventually have that connect to potentially some conservation concerns and the management side. That's long term. Okay, so this perturbation experiment. So what we did is form novel social groups, so 6 replicate groups of strangers. We know they're strangers because we got them as chicks, day-old chicks. They're super teeny tiny. They come in the mail, and then we raise them in the lab. So it took months to raise them to adult size, and then we know the history, the social history of who's interacted with who during that whole time. So we can confidently say we've got 6 replicate groups of stranger birds that have never interacted with each other before. And then what Sanjay did is 3 4-day observation periods. So those are separated by different amounts of time. So we've got 4 days and then a 3-day separation, then 4 more days. So that's our short separation. And then we've got a separation of 17 days where we ran another social group through, and then brought in the original social group afterwards and did the final 4-day chunk of observation. So Sanjay, for the quail, observes the behaviors in real time. So he's recording the context of the interactions in real time on an iPad. But he also has an overhead video camera, GoPro, up there to automate the really annoying parts of data collection, like location tracking, that are really hard to get by hand in real time and have a whole lot of accuracy and high data sampling on those. So he used this combination then to look at patterns of movement and patterns of social interaction for his larger project. The data that I'm going to show you today is just based on the interactions and just on the aggressive interactions. Okay, so again, very preliminary results, but what you can see here is weeks 1, 2, and 3 for our 6 replicate social groups here. And you can see the social dominance patterns labeled here. And what you can see is a tricky pattern to identify by eye, but I believe that we don't see a whole lot of anything changing. So generally, they're on this time scale, when we bin the data on the week-by-week time scale, we're getting, the quail are following this downward heuristic nearly all the time. We do see this one, group 2, I'm not quite sure what was going on here, week 2 of group 2. We'll have to dig into the drama on that side. But they did go to a bullying pattern for that 1 week. But generally, again, if we're pooling by week, we only observe that one deviation from the basic downward heuristic pattern. So they are forming and following a hierarchy, but they're not doing the more complex targeting behavior that we see in a lot of the parakeet replications. All right, so if we, again, go and ask this question of, is the separation of the entire group sufficient to trigger a shift in the group's social dominance pattern? At least for the quail so far, the answer is probably no. We do need to dig into the data more here, but generally the quail are generally robust against separation perturbations at this particular time scale. And they generally didn't shift to a new social dominance pattern. All right. That leaves us with a lot of open questions, right? But generally what I've showed you today is these 3 main questions so far. So what can fight-by-fight decisions tell us about what information animals are paying attention to in real time? And what I showed you with the parakeet results from Xavier's project is that the parakeets appear to be using observation and experience to rapidly choose who to fight and who to avoid fighting. And so he's got a whole suite of other aggression rules that he's digging into now. But even just this stark difference that we're seeing between these first 2 rules has been really exciting for us in terms of trying to figure out what are they paying attention to, what kind of information are they integrating and acting on. Then we asked whether what kinds of hidden patterns might structure aggression within the confines of a hierarchy, looking across lots of different species. And what I showed you is that social dominance patterns occurred really across the taxa in this data set. And groups of the same species could use different patterns. And so to follow up on that question, then we asked how flexible are these social systems and can they shift between different dominance patterns? And the data I showed you there from both the parakeets and then the quail over here indicate that some perturbations that we've done to the groups could lead to shifts in the dominance patterns, mainly in the parakeets. But the shifts in the parakeets do appear to be affected by the rank of the perturbed bird and potentially by the support of the individuals as they're reintroduced. So for example, birds that had a stable partnership that they rejoined on reintroduction suffered a lot less rank loss than individuals that came back in and did not have their partner available anymore because of a partner switch. So we're looking at now whether some of the affiliative stuff, on the affiliative side, the relationships, can potentially buffer against some rank changes with these aggression perturbations. Great. Okay, so I know I threw a lot at you there. I want to thank all of the funders for this work, my entire lab for just being amazing and doing great work despite all of the conditions that we've been under with the pandemic and so forth. And I'd be really happy to take lots and lots of questions.